I'm Julie Higgins, 27, standing in the center aisle of a sunlit ceremony hall that looks out over the river, holding one plain white envelope. The windows throw bands of gold across the polished floor, and people I spent years trying to please sit with programs in their laps. Caroline is gliding down the aisle in the lace gown I saved for, the hem whispering against the wood. I move past the rows without a tremor and place the envelope into Gregory Avery's open hand. He flips the first page, then the second. His face tightens like someone closing a door he'd hoped would stay open. Thomas watches his father read, his expression collapsing into a new kind of confusion. I don't speak. I don't explain. The paper does the work I can no longer trust words to do, and the silence becomes my authority. Before I tell you how I engineered that moment and why my family never saw it coming, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, subscribe, and switch on notifications for more family revenge stories. I read every single one. I grew up being the reliable one because no one else volunteered to be. If something needed doing, I did it. Errands, babysitting, packing lunches, smoothing over fights, making sure the car was ready and the forms were signed. It wasn't praise I wanted so much as fairness, but the messages I learned were clearer than anything Mom ever taught me: be useful and be small. Caroline, older by 4 years, took up space like she owned it. New shoes for her. Mine were like new. If she needed something, it was treated like fate. When I needed something, it was a question of endurance. I learned to read the room and to disappear into the shape of what was needed. By the time I was old enough to name what felt wrong, the roles were already language around the house. I was dependable and Caroline was gifted. Dependable meant you fixed things others broke. Gifted meant you were excused when you failed. This wasn't neglect so much as assignment. Mom called it practicality. She praised Caroline's charm the way other parents praise looks, without consequence, without accounting for what it cost someone else. When Caroline showed up late to a recital, Mom clapped the loudest. When I stayed up nights studying for a scholarship, Mom asked why I needed to make such a fuss. She taught me that praise had conditions. Show up and need nothing, and you would be safe. Be visible for the wrong reasons, and you'd be punished for what you wanted. I learned to anticipate needs before anyone voiced them. I learned how to make plans so smooth that no one noticed the work behind them. Those skills felt invisible at the time, like a muscle that grew without anyone naming it. Later, I would use that muscle for something else. Mom's favoritism wasn't subtle. She told stories about Caroline like she was auditioning to be a heroine. "Oh, Caroline would handle that," she'd say, as if the handling alone made everything better. She called Caroline's decisions brave and mine pragmatic. When I spoke up, she labeled me cold or ungrateful. When Caroline drew a line, Mom called it self-respect. Holidays were exercises in preference. Caroline's music, Caroline's desserts, Caroline's seat at the head of the table. My wants were framed as flexible. I learned to make space, to bend my schedule, to let my needs be deferred. Mom justified it as what was best for family harmony, but what she meant was strategic. Keep Caroline adored and useful to the public eye, and keep me quiet and efficient behind the scenes. That strategy worked for a long time because I believed the stories Mom told about what kept families together. Only later did I see that the stories had been a map for how to sideline me without seeming cruel. A lot of my early wounds taught me how to be silent without surrendering. I remember a summer when I'd saved every dollar for a course I wanted, an intensive that might open doors. Mom borrowed the money to cover Caroline's car repair and never gave it back, calling it a family expense. At a middle school recital, I wore a dress handed down from Caroline because Caroline had outgrown her own. When I noticed, Mom said we were being practical. At my high school awards night, Mom left early because Caroline had a social event. She told me she was doing the responsible thing and I should be proud. Each time I opened my mouth to ask for fairness, I was told I was making someone feel bad, and the lesson repeated until I stopped asking. That silence trained me. Rather than demanding restitution in the moment, I cataloged it. I started keeping small records, dates, amounts, short notes, because the world would not make space for my complaints. The habit felt petty at first, it felt like armor later. I learned to meet grief with logic. I learned to let my feelings file themselves into folders I could open when I had to. What I'm good at is the quiet kind of order people mistake for passivity. I work as an operations analyst in a hospital system. My days are full of protocols, vendor contracts, audits, and timelines. Spreadsheets calm me, they're where mess makes sense. I like noticing inconsistencies the way other people notice faces in a crowd. A missed deadline shows up in a column and tells me where work is breaking down. A pattern of small errors leads to a big failure if you don't catch it. I read contracts the way other people read novels. I look for clauses tucked into the margins, for language that lets someone off the hook. I know how to document chain of custody and why metadata matters. At work, they call me steady. My supervisor says I make complex projects feel smaller. That steadiness isn't about emotionless calculation. It's about understanding how decisions cascade. A call that seems small can authorize a transfer. A single authorized email can rewrite a contract. I learned to value redundancy, 2 confirmations instead of 1, and to make sure there were witnesses. People underestimate anyone who doesn't shout. They forget how much the quiet notice. Those habits didn't make me ruthless, they made me accurate. When my world fell apart, those same habits turned grief into a tool I could use without losing myself. Maya has a mind that lives in archives. She can find a public record from 3 counties away while brewing coffee. She knows which web pages preserve their pages as snapshots, how to make a PDF that shows a timestamp, and where to request security camera stills without triggering defenses. She once sat at my table for 3 hours while I rattled through names and dates, and she typed them into a spreadsheet as if she were recording evidence for a future I couldn't yet see. She color-coded things: red for urgent, yellow for needs verification, green for corroborated, and the screen filled with rectangles that suddenly made my story feel measurable. She also keeps receipts metaphorically and literally. If a vendor says one thing, Maya makes them say it in writing or on a recorded call. If a social post matters, she captures it with multiple screenshots and saves the page to a cloud folder so nothing disappears. She knows how to freeze a moment so it can't be edited away. When I started whispering about my vendors, the dress, the deposits, she sat forward and said, "We don't argue. We prove." That line felt like armor the first night I slept on my own because I refused to let anyone else decide how I was counted. Maya doesn't rush me emotionally. She asks for structure and then gives me space inside that structure to be anything I need to be. She's the one who taught me chain of custody in practical terms: pictures, backups, witnesses, dates. She signed onto this with her eyes open. She arranged timestamps, saved emails as PDFs, and told me to breathe only when it was time to breathe. When I say she kept receipts, what I mean is she kept the truth in a drawer where it couldn't be burned. Caroline's public image was a carefully lit stage. She was the woman who smiled for donors, whose speeches at fundraisers felt like confessions without consequence. She wrote blog posts about compassion and posted photos where she held hands with seniors while wearing a scarf that matched her hair. People loved her because she looked as if she'd stepped out of a story about redemption: accessible, warm, full of purpose. In public, her sentences were polished and complete. She used the word impact like it was a vow, and she had that convenient way of making small mistakes sound like noble risks. But at home, Caroline's pattern was different. She borrowed things and forgot to return them. She promised to pay me back for shared expenses and didn't. She told versions of events that tilted to her advantage because she counted on other people, not comparing notes. That habit extended into how she handled work. Invoices that weren't reconciled, donations acknowledged on a page but not reflected on a ledger, and an odd tendency to move money in ways that made sense only to her. She would charm a room and then flinch away if asked to produce receipts. It was like watching a mirror selfie edited so many times the person in it began to look real. Caroline cultivated plausible deniability. She told good stories and then leaned on the stories when things went wrong. Mom loved those stories and repeated them like scripture. If someone challenged Caroline, she would tilt her head and make a face that implied she'd been misunderstood, not maligned. That face worked because families and boards and donors wanted to trust the light in a person's eyes. They wanted to believe. I kept noticing inconsistencies, small bookkeeping errors, canceled checks that didn't match deposit records, but it felt petty to hold on to that suspicion until the evidence was so plain it wasn't my worry anymore. When the proof came, it didn't surprise me that she'd built a life on appearances. It only made me see how many places she'd relied on other people's faith instead of facing consequences. I built that wedding the way I build other things. By thinking through the worst-case scenarios and making plans that made them irrelevant. I picked a brick-on timber event space on the river because light matters in pictures and in memory. It gives a ceremony a shape that the camera understands. I wanted the room to be warm without being fussy. The venue had oak beams and windows that caught the sun in long gold bars in the late afternoon. I paid the venue deposit from my account and saved the confirmation email in a folder labeled wedding, bold letters. I booked a caterer who listened when I said dietary notes mattered. I hired a photographer who understood shapes and who made sure his contract included a shot list. I ordered a 3-tier buttercream cake with pressed flowers because I'd seen one once in a magazine and kept the image for years. I spent nights altering the timeline to account for traffic, vendor setup, and a gap in case someone's dress needed a last-minute stitch. My dress was an obsession I'd earned. It was vintage lace I'd been saving for since college. It arrived from the boutique and I took it home wrapped like something fragile and important. I paid for 2 rounds of alterations so the neckline would sit right on my shoulders. I remember the seamstress measuring me and saying it fit the way it was meant to fit, close in the waist, soft at the shoulders. I left receipts and notes with the boutique, and I entered every payment into my personal ledger with the same exactitude I used at work. I compiled vendor packets for each person involved. Contact trees, contingency plans, backups if a cake decorator fell sick or a microphone failed. I had emergency numbers listed on a single card, 3 people for every vendor, because I didn't want chaos to look like incompetence on my day. Everything was paid for with money I'd saved from years of overtime shifts, a promotion, and a habit of putting away small amounts until they added up. I had the receipts to prove it. Venue deposit, caterer retainer, photographer deposit, cake payment, dress balance. I imagined a ceremony that felt honest and small and true, just a handful of friends, family who meant it, a river like a witness. I didn't want spectacle, I wanted the things I could control to be right. That sense of control, of step-by-step planning, is part of how I keep myself from losing my footing. I'd done it before at work. I'd do it now to keep what was mine. The first misstep I didn't make arrived in my inbox like a rumor. A scheduler from the venue sent an email with the subject line, "Confirming your cancellation." My stomach dropped flat. I opened it and read a short paragraph, "We've processed your cancellation per authorization." I typed back immediately, "I did not cancel." There was a pause, then a reply that used language that felt slippery. "Someone on file confirmed changes." 2 hours later, a vendor called and said, "Your mother authorized the move." My phone lit up with numbers I didn't recognize. I called them back and heard pleasant voices telling me the same sentence. "Your mother confirmed," delivered like a formality, like civic duty. Maya told me to screenshot everything. She told me to save emails as PDFs and to start logging calls with dates and times. I did as she said because I trusted her instincts. When I walked into Mom's kitchen that afternoon with printed contracts in my hands, pages curling slightly from being handled, Caroline was already there, sipping tea like the guest of honor. Mom talked as if she'd done me a favor. "Your vendors were relieved you finally faced reality." Caroline flitted at the edges, offering sympathy that read like a performance. "I asked who had spoken for me." Mom said, "I did. Someone had to be responsible." It was a sentence shaped to end debate. I checked my phone settings and email rules and forwarding addresses. Nothing on my end had been changed. No hacker had breached my accounts. Whoever had made the changes knew enough about how I organized my life to imitate my voice. My heart was pounding in a way that felt new, looser, and angrier at once. Maya texted, screenshot call logs, voicemail, everything. She sent me a checklist and a comfort emoji. I did it, filling folders named exactly and repeatedly. The discovery didn't make me cry then, it made me quiet and cold the way calculation does. I had a list, and lists are blueprints. The first misstep wasn't that they thought they could get away with it. The first misstep was assuming I would stay silent while they rearranged my life. Who spoke for me? I asked, calm because calm makes people reveal their discomfort in ways they can't sculpt into a story. Caroline smiled, that small, practiced smile, the one that deflects and frames trouble as an inconvenience to be handled. Mom looked over the top of her glasses and said, "I did it for your own good. Someone had to be responsible." The words were polished and rehearsed like a press release. They were meant to end a conversation. I wanted facts. I wanted names, times, phone numbers. Mom answered like it was personal. "You've been so overwhelmed." Caroline sighed, as if my feeling overwhelmed was itself evidence that I could not be trusted with decisions. I reached for my phone to play a voicemail I'd already saved, the recording of a call that used my cadence but not my consent. Before I could press play, Mom said, "Don't threaten us," the kind of phrase families use to paint accountability as aggression. It was a move meant to shift the conversation from what happened to how I had the nerve to notice. Caroline rolled her eyes and said softly, "Don't make this messy." That line was both a command and a prophecy. Mom finished for her. "It was better this way." They treated the theft of my day like a kindness. I remember the light through the kitchen window that afternoon, soft, ordinary, how normal it was outside, how small the world felt when people you trusted turned against you. I left with my contracts, my voice kept in the folder where I stored things until they mattered enough to act. Every lie they told left a paper trail. I started collecting the receipts they slipped into corners and expected would never be found. The deposits were the clearest proof of more than just stolen plans. Vendor after vendor confirmed the same sentence with different cadences. "Your mother authorized the transfer. Your name was removed from the contract. We've updated our records." The venue sent an amended agreement with my date still circled but Caroline's name in the contact line. My heart lodged in my throat when I saw it. The same day that used to say JULIEHIGGINS in clean capital letters now hosted a different name on the signature line. The cake designer called to politely inform me that the pressed flower cascade I'd chosen had been refiled as a natural look favored by the new bride. The bakery's voicemail was bright and bafflingly cheerful while taking my design and handing it to someone else. The dress boutique left a text, "We understand the change. Caroline has collected the gown." I felt my teeth pressed together hard enough to hurt. I had the receipt in my account. The deposit, the alteration fees, every cent came from my savings tracked in a spreadsheet I kept because I had to be the adult in charge of my own life. Someone Mom and Caroline together had signed on my behalf or convinced vendors I had. When I dug into the payment methods, I found notes that payments were switched to a card with Caroline's name and Mom's confirmation call. My money hadn't just bought a dress and a cake. It had been repurposed into props for a performance staged in my absence. It was worse than that because stealing the money was only half the crime. They'd stolen the narrative too. They changed who I was in front of other people. They told the caterer, the florist, the photographer, and the venue staff that I had accepted this outcome willingly. They explained my disappearance with the kind of line families use to handle inconvenient truths. "She's not ready. It's for the best." By moving their version into the public sphere, into emails, into the binders of vendors, into the polite small talk of the venue, they dressed theft in the language of care. That was the real betrayal. They rewrote my voice so that the public believed my absence was voluntary. The sentence that cut the deepest arrived at a group tasting the weekday after the amended contract. The venue hosted several couples that night. Plates clinked and wine glasses chimed, and my name card sat where it had always been laid on the sample table. Mom showed up with Caroline like they were arriving for a happy family reunion. The coordinator glided over, smiled, and addressed Caroline as if she were the one who had reserved the date. My stomach narrowed into a small, bitter knot. I asked the coordinator to check for authorization and for any note that said I had canceled. Her chair made a little screech as she leaned back. There were no official notes in my name, just a voiced claim from Mom and a confirmation that the venue had been told to update their records. Mom said it in a voice pitched for the room, the kind you reserve for explanations to witnesses. "She's overwhelmed, we're stepping in." Caroline nodded and added with a casual cruelty that stunned me even then, "It's better this way, be divorced within 2 years anyway." The sentence fell into the room like a verdict. I felt the air thicken and the sound of a spoon against a plate became louder, as if every small noise had to work harder to cover what was being said. People glanced toward me with the curious look of strangers watching an unfolding drama. Some faces softened toward Caroline and Mom because certainty attracts sympathy faster than truth does. The coordinator began a sentence that drifted off without a finish, as if she'd been trained to avoid family storms. The caterer looked at his hands. A woman 2 tables over smiled awkwardly and swallowed a laugh. I said only, "I did not authorize any changes," and Mom replied with the kind of dismissal that had been her uniform for years. "Don't embarrass yourself." That last line was meant to shame me into silence. Instead, it recorded itself into the notebook I kept in my bag. I wrote down names, words, witness reactions. The room felt like a sealed case study in how people migrate toward the loudest version of a story. Silence did not protect me, it made me invisible until I decided not to be. My fiancé went quiet in a way that left space for other people to fill. He'd been honest with me from early on about a work crisis that could not be moved, an out-of-state project with deadlines and stakeholders who wanted answers yesterday. He asked for days, then weeks, and I believed him because I trusted him to tell me the truth. After the tasting night, he texted, "Can we pause the date? This is spiraling." He wasn't telling me he didn't care. He was telling me he couldn't be present. In the weeks that followed, his messages came less often. He sent apologies that read like schedules shuffled around and promises that began with "I hope." There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching someone erode away in text messages when all you need is a single person to be solid beside you. Mom heard his hesitation and turned it into proof. She said, "See, even he knows," like his absence was definitive evidence I couldn't stand on my own, and for a moment I felt that old reflex. To beg, to plead, to explain until someone changed their mind. I stopped myself. I realized begging would not make the calls that had been made unmade. Begging would only make me smaller. I had a choice then: wait for rescue that might never come or become the rescuer I needed. I chose the latter. I stopped waiting for someone to fix what was broken and started listing what would need to happen for me to fix it myself. The decision felt like stepping out of a shadow I'd lived in for so long I didn't know daylight could be measured by action rather than hope. Observation meant I didn't let anyone gaslight me into confusion. When a vendor said, "Your mother confirmed," I asked for the exact wording and the call time. When a coordinator said they had an amendment on file, I asked to see it emailed to my address. I recorded calls where allowed and politely asked for written confirmations where recording wasn't permitted. Maya taught me little legal housekeeping tricks: save emails as PDFs, capture web pages with timestamps, request camera stills with exact timestamps. I learned to document not out of spite but out of necessity. The notebook became a map of where words had been used to change reality and where paper could restore it. We did not march to relatives. We did not scream in neighbors' yards. I left the family meetings with extra copies of contracts in my bag. I froze web pages and took screenshots so no post could be edited away. I asked for vendor affidavits and offered vendors quiet, legally safe language they could put in writing without making enemies at work. When someone asked why I wasn't making a scene, I told them I wanted something steadier than noise. Noise gets swallowed, paper does not. The more I watched without flaring, the more the pattern showed itself. It was not a string of small wrongs, it was a system. Observation let me trace the system instead of being trapped inside it. Maya then asked the question that shifted everything from suspicion to strategy. What else would Caroline take if she thought taking was the same as leading? We sat with that sentence like a loaded thing. Caroline worked at a nonprofit that served seniors. She wrote compassionate copy, she smiled at donors. But what if that smile hit a ledger that didn't add up? We began to look in places a casual observer wouldn't. I downloaded 3 years of the nonprofit's public tax forms and read every line like a detective reading a confession. There were entries labeled emergency medical stipends with round dollar amounts that reappeared on the same months year after year. Donation totals on the website didn't match the reported totals. Names of donors on thank you pages sometimes vanished from the official filings. We started matching names from donor lists to public records and to small claims cases in county court. A pattern threaded through like a single red stitch: elderly donors with limited involvement and sometimes confused signatures. Charges appeared on retail cards opened in their names with purchases listed as medical supplies and shipments going to a mailbox registered to the nonprofit. It was the kind of thing that would read as plausible to people who wanted to think the world was orderly. But the details didn't fit. The IP address traced to an office laptop registered to Caroline's payroll account. The caregiver of one woman swore she'd never authorized a card. Each little inconsistency made the whole thing less like mismanagement and more like predation. We sketched a hypothesis that had teeth. Caroline was using her access to elderly donors to open accounts in their names, charging those accounts, and covering it with narrative lines on public documents that read like legitimate expenses. The numbers were small enough to slide under many radars, but many enough to add up. If we could prove one clear-cut case tied to someone in Thomas's family, the quilt of explanations they'd stitched together would unravel in front of people who cared. That thought hardened us. It wasn't anger alone that pushed me, it was the obligation of seeing that real harm was happening and knowing how to trace it. I had the skills set to follow threads. Maya had the patience to pull at them until the seams showed. The group tasting night at the venue is the kind of memory you can still smell. Lemon zests from the amuse-bouche, roast beef on a plate that steamed in the cool room, linen that smelled faintly of starch. The venue had arranged several couples at shared long tables so planners could see how plates and centerpieces read in conversation. My place card sat where it always had been intended, between 2 small floral arrangements, my name written in the calligrapher's neat hand. I had imagined sitting there with my fiancé, tasting the cake, making small jokes. Instead, I sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching Mom and Caroline arrive like they owned the night. Caroline wore a dress that matched the pastel flowers on the tasting menu. She moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to be seen. Mom held herself the way people hold chairs to hide a crack. Her smile was smooth and rehearsed. The coordinator, who'd been so careful with invoices earlier in the week, drifted toward them with a smile that was a conciliatory gesture. She addressed Caroline as if she were the one booking the date. I asked the coordinator to check the system for my authorization, just a simple request, and she clicked through her tablet with the kind of discomfort that makes a person's shoulders tilt inward. Her notes showed only a caller on the line, a confirmation, a maternal voice. There was no signature from me on the updated order, there was only the echo of my mother's name in the digital record. Around us, other couples chatted and sampled dishes. The acoustics of the timber beams made conversations wrap into one another like ribbons. A man at the next table leaned in and said, "This place has great reviews," and I wanted to tell him that he was sitting in my plan. I felt the air pressure in the room change as history rearranged itself into something else. The space that had been reserved for the ceremony in my mind was now populated with a version of reality Mom and Caroline were handing out. I sat, took notes on the napkin beneath my plate, and watched people accept a story because it was served with enough confidence. The tasting, designed to be a preview of a joyful day, had become a stage where my absence was being rewritten. Then Mom said it loud enough for a few heads to turn. "She's overwhelmed, we're stepping in for her own good." The line landed like a gavel. Caroline added the knife. "It's better this way, be divorced within 2 years anyway." The words felt surgical, precise, as if they had been practiced to land with maximal humiliation. I felt a cold like glass run along the inside of my ribs. People nearby shifted in their seats. The caterer paused mid-sentence with a spoon halfway to his lips. Some faces softened toward Mom and Caroline because certainty is comforting. Others looked at me with the kind of curiosity reserved for an unfolding play. I said very little aloud. I wrote down the time in my notebook and the exact words because words are evidence when memory can be twisted. A woman 2 tables over touched my shoulder as a reflex of sympathy, and I nodded gratefully, but I did not beg or rail. Mom's voice slid into the room like a polished demonstration of care, while Caroline's cruel aside landed like a verdict. The coordinator drifted away, avoiding the confrontation like a professional avoiding litigation. In that small, fluorescent-lit room with food on the table and a calligraphed card bearing my name, I felt the moment crystallize into fact. The sentence everyone heard would later be replayed against them, not as proof of my weakness, but as the motive for my decision to stop accepting being erased. The worst part was how easily people accepted the version Mom and Caroline offered. I watched faces tilt toward them, sympathy forming like a soft curtain, while mine felt invisible in the light. They told the story that fit. I was overwhelmed, I wasn't ready, we were protecting you from failure. Those sentences rearranged the room around them. A vendor would apologize and then confirm Caroline's new booking as if nothing had happened. My planner tried to be neutral, but her notebook filled with Caroline's name where mine used to be. Each entry was a new inch of proof that the theft had a polite wrapper. I cataloged the details with hands that felt steady and numb at once. Phone logs, emails, the venue amendment, each piece went into my folder. I copied messages, printed receipts from the dress boutique, and saved screen captures of Caroline's posts. The thread that tied it together wasn't dramatic, it was arithmetic. Dates, times, and the quiet voice of my mother on calls where she sounded like someone making a reasonable choice. They had removed my agency one signature at a time and handed the results to a room full of people who wanted a tidy explanation. When the boutique sent that text, "We understand the change, Caroline has collected the gown," it felt like a strike. The gown was mine in the way money and years of careful saving make something yours. I thought of the seamstress pinning lace at 3 in the afternoon while I sat in the small back room, tapping my foot and watching the hem fall right. I remembered paying the initial deposit with a card tied to the account where I kept wedding money, watching the confirmation ping onto my phone with a calm that comes from checking off a long-held plan. To see someone else walk out with the dress because Mom had called and said she could pick it up was like watching a photograph be cut from an album. Later, I listened to the bakery's cheerful voicemail explaining the cake change, and the stitch in my chest tightened. The cake I'd imagined, 3 tiers, pressed flowers, pale buttercream, became an item on someone else's feed with Caroline's caption and heart emojis. It was absurd and tender and violently personal. I checked my ledger and my bank statements. The deposits were all there, entries with my name next to amounts and dates. But the vendors had attached notes, authorized by family, collected by proxy, transferred by request. It read like consent even when it wasn't given. Caroline posted a mirror selfie in the dress and wrote, "Found the one," as if the dress had always been hers. The boutique's image of her holding the gown arrived with a timestamp that matched a call Mom had made that afternoon. Snapshots do not tell the whole truth, but they tell enough. I screenshotted, downloaded, and backed up until my cloud folders hummed with evidence. That night I sat with the receipts spread out across the kitchen table and felt something inside me change. Grief turned into a grid of dates and names. The fact I'd been erased felt like a machine you could disassemble if you knew which bolts to remove. I didn't implode. I wrote a single line at the top of a clean page. Make it undeniable, make it public, make it consequential. The sentence was a cold little compass pointing to a decision. I had two choices: try to wrest the day back in the face of a family who would talk over me, or use what I knew, how documents travel, how people react to timing, how shame can be shifted, to force consequences that would matter beyond a rumor. I chose the latter. The mission was not about spectacle, it was about leverage. If I could connect the polite theft of my wedding to something uglier, patterns of taking that hurt people who could not protect themselves, then the stakes would be bigger than my humiliation. That night I made a plan that was equal parts patience and pressure. I wanted a public unraveling staged in a space they prized: community, reverence, the company of people their choices would actually hurt. I wanted a way to place the truth where it couldn't be smoothed into a story about caring relatives. I also wanted to guard myself against the small things that derail the best-laid plans. Leaks, tantrums, a last-minute apology that could placate, so I wrote rules, short, strict rules. They were adhesive for a brittle resolve. Rule 1: no arguments, only evidence. Anger is loud and messy and easy to dismiss. Documents are quieter and harder to refute. Rule 2: control the timing. I would not drop anything until all parts were in place and the moment would force a response. Rule 3: double corroboration. Every claim needed two independent supports: a captured call and a vendor note, a saved post and a bank entry, so the story could survive scrutiny. Rule 4: never negotiate directly when possible. I would route communication through third parties or through recorded channels. Rule 5: protect the witnesses. If a vendor wanted to help, I would give them safe language and shield them from fallout. Rule 6: plan for silence. I would keep my face composed and my words minimal so the documents could speak instead of my emotion being mistaken for motive. Meyer agreed to be a redundancy. If I faltered, she would press send. We rehearsed the logistics in a careful way, like setting up a sequence of dominoes and making sure each one fell exactly where it must. The rules were not about cruelty, they were about precision. They turned my hurt into a system that could be measured, evaluated, and delivered. They gave moral shape to a plan that had the small dignity of being inevitable. I found a coordinator's internal note that made my skin prickle. It was a short message between staff. Mother called, said Julie in treatment, proceed as discussed. Seeing that wrote a different sentence than the story Mom told at dinner. I labeled that note Exhibit 1 and added metadata. Who saved the note when it was sent, which terminal it was sent from. For every file we had, I added where it came from and how we could prove it hadn't been altered: photographic receipts of paper copies, screenshots with browser timestamps, and emails forwarded with full headers. Maya taught me to note the chain of possession in plain language: who saw it first, who kept it next, and where it was stored. That way nothing could be dismissed as hearsay. We arranged vendor statements next to the voice recordings of my mother. The contrast was sharp. A polite venue representative saying, "We recorded the call from Mrs. Higgins," and a voicemail that used my cadence to authorize a transfer. The timeline showed sequence, voice, authorization, update to contract, and then the public post Caroline made crowing about her new dress. Putting all those pieces in order removed story from speculation and left only action. The spreadsheet became our truth in a format that tolerated questions. If anyone wanted to argue, they could start with the timeline and work backward. That was exactly the point. I went to the dress boutique first. I asked for the manager and explained I needed clear, written confirmation of what had happened on the pickup day. The manager, who had been polite when I booked the appointment, looked uncomfortable until I showed the receipt and the time-stamped text that said Caroline had collected the gown. She admitted on a recorded call that her staff had released the dress after a phone call from my mother. She pulled a camera still from their security feed, Caroline walking out with the box at 2:14 in the afternoon. The photo had a timestamp and a blonde head I recognized. The cake shop gave me similar cooperation after a quiet conversation. The owner remembered the pressed flower design and confirmed she had been told to refile the order under Caroline's name. She pulled a printed order form and signed a short affidavit stating who had called and what had been requested. We drafted a clear, neutral affidavit for the boutique and the bakery that said only the facts. Date, time, who spoke, and what they did in response. I promised to keep their names out of any public release unless the court required it because vendors didn't want to be dragged through drama. In exchange, they gave me documents that would not be easy to dismiss. Then I turned to the nonprofit's public records. I downloaded the past 3 years of the nonprofit's Internal Revenue Service tax filings and sat on the floor with them spread like pages of a slow-burning book. I read line by line. There were entries labeled emergency medical stipends, round numbers that showed up in July and October across multiple years. Donation totals in the public report didn't match the numbers listed on the website's donor thank you page. Some donors credited on the website didn't appear on official filings. Other times, totals were rounded up in ways that made small gaps look like accounting choices instead of omissions. I dug into state filings and found late penalties listed in small print, missed registration dates that suggested sloppy compliance or deliberate delay. The nonprofit newsletter archive had thank you posts that referenced donors by name while the tax forms showed different figures. I started making columns to cross-reference donor acknowledgments with reported totals. The mismatches were not random. The pattern looked like padding and erasures, money showing up in public-facing lists but not in the accounting that mattered. That pattern suggested more than poor bookkeeping. It suggested someone was making the paper reflect a different reality than the bank did. Following the money meant following names and addresses. I searched county court records and found small claims suits where elderly people or their families contested charges they didn't authorize, cards opened in their names, bills they didn't recognize. The names repeated in a way that made my chest tighten. I called one plaintiff, a granddaughter who lived 3 towns away, and explained who I was and why I needed her help. She sent over copies of the complaint and the card statements. The shipping addresses on those cards matched a mailbox rented in the nonprofit's name. The same mailbox appeared on donation receipts in other documents I'd scraped. I made a list of 10 suspicious credit lines and matched those to donor names and to dates of contributions. In several cases, charges labeled as medical supplies went to the same retailers and were billed at round amounts. When I traced the online application entries, an IP address pinged back to a network registered to the nonprofit's office computer. For one elderly donor, the caregiver provided a sworn note saying the donor had never signed or authorized a card application. The details stacked up until the pattern read like a method instead of a mistake. It stopped being a secret between Caroline and Mom and started being a problem the state had to see. Maya circled the names and said quietly, "This is enough to move." I felt the same thin, focused fear and a strange sort of relief. The map was nearly complete. Now we needed to decide how to present it so the people who needed to act would have no choice but to look. Dorothy's bank statements were the kind of small tragedy that takes time to stitch together. There were retail charges on a card I'd never expect for an 87-year-old woman, round sums, repetitive vendors, and a shipping address that matched the mailbox registered to Caroline's nonprofit. The card itself had been opened online with Dorothy's name and an address she'd given for donations. The caregiver swore Dorothy had never applied for such a card and that Dorothy could be confused about numbers, which was part of the point. Confusion is a weapon when someone wants to create plausible use. I held the caregiver's notarized affidavit in my hands and felt a clarity that was equal parts relief and dread. This was no longer an abstract pattern. It was a real person with a name and a family that would, in time, have to face what had been done. When I traced the application metadata, the IP address pinged back to a network associated with the nonprofit office. That detail was the hinge. It tied the fraudulent application to a place Caroline had access to during work hours. I printed the bank statements, the affidavit, and the IP logs and placed them in a folder labeled for clarity. Exhibit O. Dorothy Avery. For the first time since the cancellations, I felt like I held something that could not be waved away as sibling drama. This was harm that extended into someone else's life and into a family I hadn't meant to drag into my fight. The fact that it did not keep me from the work felt like a kind of responsibility. If their theft reached into a grandmother's wallet, the stakes were bigger than my wedding dress. I didn't want to be the person who yelled about wrongdoing on social media. I wanted authorities to move with the weight that legal paperwork can compel. So I set up appointments with the people whose job it was to follow money and watch nonprofits. A state charity regulator and a bank fraud investigator. I sat in an understated office with a regulator who listened with a professional quiet that made me trust him instantly. He asked for a clear packet, an executive summary, exhibits, a source list, and a timeline. I gave it to him in a 3-ring binder and watched his face change as he flipped through the exhibits. He told me calmly that they would need time to review before any public action so investigations weren't compromised. I agreed, but I also negotiated timing. I had spent weeks making sure the facts were airtight because I knew publicity at the wrong moment could ruin an official response. He appreciated that. We arranged a delay in public release that still allowed them to freeze accounts and request records quietly. A bank fraud unit agreed to review the questionable card accounts and to place holds pending verification. The investigator asked for copies of the statements and the notarized caregiver affidavit. I handed them over and watched as he took notes with the same care I took organizing my spreadsheet. He explained in simple terms what would happen next: holds on accounts, contacting affected institutions, and tracing the payment flows. He emphasized that law enforcement would need time to build a case that could support criminal charges rather than a public scolding. That made sense. I wanted the system to do the heavy lifting and to be able to say later that the claims had not been the invention of an angry sister but the result of a regulated review. At the same time, I retained a small civil attorney to handle tortious interference claims and to prepare a complaint that would be filed if the wedding proceeded under false pretenses. Her office smelled like coffee and paper. I told her the plan in blunt terms, and she wrote notes like someone arranging steps for a difficult choreography. We drafted a complaint that named Mom as Elaine Higgins and Caroline Higgins. It was factual, not theatrical, listing exhibits and specific harm. We spoke to a process server, Marla Singh, who specialized in serving papers in visible places without making scenes. Marla listened to the plan and nodded, saying she could arrange service at a specific time and place if we wanted a public acknowledgement rather than a quiet delivery. The idea of serving during the ceremony felt performative at first, but performance was part of my leverage. The people they wanted to impress would be right there, and the acknowledgement would not be something they could filter through charm. We scheduled service for the aisle, timed to the moment people would be most attentive. I practiced how to stand, where to place myself, and what to say if anyone asked. My attorney advised a one-sentence line: check the documents. It was cold and satisfying in its economy. I wanted to leave space for the evidence to do its work. I wanted the paper to speak as plainly as the law would later. If anything escalated, Marla would handle it with the procedural calm she was paid for. I liked that her presence would make the delivery official rather than vengeful. The envelope I prepared for Gregory Avery was small and heavy with intent. I crafted a cover letter that said nothing more than, "For your mother, evidence requiring immediate attention." Inside the packet was a one-page timeline that condensed months of work into a readable sequence: call times, vendor updates, and key public posts, so any busy parent could follow the arc at a glance. Exhibit A was Dorothy Avery's fraudulent card application, the retail statements, and the caregiver's notarized affidavit. Exhibit B contained the nonprofit's financial anomalies. Cross-references between reported totals and donor thank you lists, the mailbox address used for shipments, and the IP logs tying an application to the nonprofit's office computer. Exhibit C gathered the vendor affidavits and a still from the dress boutique security camera showing Caroline leaving with the gown. I added a QR code linked to a secure cloud folder that contained full exhibits and metadata for anyone who wanted to dig deeper. I printed 2 copies and sealed one for Gregory and one for myself. On the cover I wrote, simply and without flourish, "Do not ignore this." I rehearsed the line I would say when I handed it to Gregory, "Sir, for your mother," and practiced stepping back a pace so I would be neutral and not theatrical. I wasn't interested in spectacle for spectacle's sake. I wanted a person who loved Dorothy and who would feel a responsibility to respond to have the documents directly in his hands. The envelope wasn't a threat. It was an obligation. If Gregory opened it and read it, he would have to make decisions about his family and his mother's reputation in the same room where Caroline had tried to stage a triumph. That imbalance is what I hoped would make them stop thinking of me as a problem and start thinking of themselves as accountable people. We planned disguises, 2 small ones that kept attention off me until the key moment. I reserved seats near the aisle under a relative's name who assumed reconciliation. They were happy to play the part. Maya pretended she was just another guest, perched 3 rows back with a look on her face that said she was listening more than watching. We staggered sends so the regulator's notice would hit inboxes at the same time the paper changed hands. If anyone leaked, we'd have evidence of who had it and when, because Maya mirrored every file to a secure folder. We also prepared vendor affidavits to be handed to the venue manager in person during the pause so the manager couldn't claim ignorance. Emotional discipline was the hardest part. I practiced in front of a mirror until the expression felt like a tool rather than armor. I kept my shoulders down and my breathing slow. I wore a dark, simple dress that read as ordinary at a distance and exact up close. I practiced the single sentence I'd allow myself to say, "Sir, for your mother." Everything else was in the envelope. I put my phone on record not for posting but to preserve the sound of the room. Maya promised if I faltered she would press send on the scheduled emails. We'd given the moment redundancy, disguise, and the moral shape of a plan. I stepped into the aisle feeling like a person walking toward a consequence I had both earned and prepared for. I walked the aisle I had planned to walk as a bride, but my steps were not the steps of someone walking into hope. The light hit the floor planks in the same way I'd imagined on late afternoons. Long bars of sun that make dust look like gold. The flowers and the lace and the gathered faces were all the props of a life that was supposed to be mine that day. I passed rows of people who glanced up with the small curiosities of wedding guests. Caroline was at the front, my lace dress making her look like she had always belonged to that moment. She smiled with the confidence of someone who thought nothing could touch her. I kept my face steady. I closed the gap between us and stopped a pace behind Gregory Avery. He looked up at me with the blank, soft confusion of someone trying to balance ceremony and attention. I handed him the envelope with both hands. The paper was warm from my grip. I said quietly, "Sir, for your mother," and stepped back exactly 1 pace so I would be neutral and not theatrical. Thomas's eyes moved from his father to me. Caroline's smile tried to hold, but there was a small hitch where it faltered. The room inhaled. No one spoke. That silence did what I could not. It focused attention on a single object and the person who had put it there. Gregory read the cover note and then flipped to the 1-page timeline. He took his time, reading as if the world had narrowed to the black lines on white paper. He murmured, "Dorothy," then turned the page and his jaw set. He tapped the QR code at the bottom and his phone opened to a folder labeled for the Avery family. He scrolled and the room felt like it moved in slow motion. A name repeated, then a balance, then a shipping address that matched a nonprofit mailbox. His face changed like someone watching a photograph morph into a confession. Thomas watched his father's face drain of color. He stepped down from the altar, hesitation in his shoulders and the certainty of his next step wobbling. Caroline's smile tightened and then slipped away. She glanced at Mom and Mom's expression went thin. I did not speak. I let the documents do their job. Friends shifted in their chairs. Someone said, "Is that?" and stopped. Gregory put the folder down, his hands slightly trembling as if the paper were heavier than it looked. The officiant, realizing something had changed, looked toward him and then toward the back doors. In that slow, held moment, the reading had done what planning and patience had been for. It had made the private evidences public in the place they had been trying to show off. Then the aisle doors opened and Marla Singh walked in like someone whose job is to make uncomfortable things official. She was calm and precise in a way that silenced the drama. She carried 2 envelopes and wore the practicality of someone who knew how to bind attention without adding heat. "Service of legal papers," she announced, naming both my mother and Caroline in full. The words landed flat and formal in the warm room and changed the tenor from insult to notice. She walked to their chairs and placed the envelopes in both their hands with a firmness that said the law was now involved. Caroline's face went red. She clutched the lace at her chest as if to anchor herself. Mom sputtered something like, "How dare you," and turned toward me with an accusation in her voice. I looked at the floor so I would not be baited into arguing. The officiant stopped the music and the venue manager told the staff to hold service. Gregory's phone rang. It was the investigator confirming a hold on accounts. The board member who sat 2 rows back checked her messages and her eyes widened. People who had been leaning toward spectacle now leaned toward procedure. Marla read a short script as she documented the delivery and told them how to respond if they wanted to contest the papers. It was sterile and precise, exactly what I wanted. The room filled with a different kind of noise. Calls being made, neighbors murmuring, the whisper of chairs as people stood uncertainly. Caroline clutched the pages but did not open them. Mom read a line and then reread it, the words moving as if through water. I felt the tide change in a way that was both terrible and necessary. The ceremony had been the stage for their triumph. Now that stage held documents they could not simply explain away. I stood because there was nowhere else to be, hands empty except for the small, lasting calm of having set things in motion that made accountability impossible to ignore. The venue manager silenced the string quartet. Forks ceased on plates. For the first second after Gregory's word, everything felt suspended, like someone had pressed pause on a film. I could hear my own breath. Maya texted me a single checkmark emoji. It felt like Morse code for everything we had set in motion. People started making calls of their own. Mrs. Patel from the nonprofit board whispered into her phone, "We received a notice." And then she looked directly at Caroline, who sat like someone waiting for applause that would not come. Caroline's expression changed from a smile to a thin line. Mom's hand flew to her mouth as if to cover a sound that wanted to escape. Then the investigator on Gregory's line said, "We'll also be calling your mother to confirm certain transactions." Gregory's jaw tightened. He covered the receiver and looked at Thomas as if he wanted to hand him the phone and step back into a clean man who had not been told anything. Thomas's face had the look of someone whose life had just split into 2 tracks, one that led forward and one that turned back to things he'd believed were private. He stepped down from the altar like a man removing a bandage slowly, and his eyes scanned the room for a place to stand. Thomas took the folder, and the paper felt heavier in his hands than it had in Gregory's. He read and reread the caregiver's affidavit, the card statements showing charges billed to his grandmother, and the shipping addresses that matched the nonprofit's mailbox. His face moved through confusion into something like betrayal. He looked at Caroline and asked, loud enough for the first 3 rows, "Did you use my grandmother's name to open these accounts?" For a moment she looked like she was about to lie. Then she denied it, but the denial had a tremor. "She tried to turn the accusation, forged this to ruin us," she said, "but I heard the caregiver's name clear as a bell because Gregory, without hesitation, put the phone on speaker and called the caregiver." The caregiver confirmed the affidavit, her voice steady and horrified. Thomas's knees gave the slightest hitch, and for a breathless second he looked exactly as I had the night their posts and dress photos first appeared, uncertain and stunned. The room shifted again, this time into social breaking. The donor who had been sitting with his partner 2 tables over stood up and said, If those funds were misused, I want my name off that list and my pledge withdrawn. A woman I recognized from a neighborhood book club tugged on a napkin and then reached into her purse to write a check with a different payee. Someone else, one of the nonprofit's regular volunteers, rose and said, "I'll be at the board meeting." A friend of Caroline's, who had been smiling for photos, packed up her things and left quietly, the sound of her heels a small punctuation mark. The maid of honor, who had been rummaging through a clutch, slipped away with hands shaking, then returned to take a seat at the very back. She kept her phone face down and avoided eye contact. The social scaffolding Caroline had built started to creak. Mom made a face like she was trying to convince herself the room would realign with her story, but texts started arriving at her phone, curt and unadorned. Invitations she had assumed would support her were answered with silence, then with questions. A donor on the second row closed his laptop and said loud enough, "I need to speak to my accountant before I make any more contributions." The venue manager came up to Gregory and whispered, "We have to document all of this," and then he moved to the staff to begin a new kind of checklist, one that was not about platters or seating but about records and incident reports. Caroline's friends, who had been ready with champagne flutes, looked stranded. Mom's social circle, which had always orbited her like a small, predictable weather pattern, broke into smaller, uncertain groups. People who had loved her performative calm now searched for the version of Mom that could explain herself. I had rehearsed what I would say if anyone demanded explanation. I'd kept it short on purpose because I didn't want my voice to be the thing people used to measure motive. I said quietly to Gregory, "I'm sorry to do this today. I made sure you had what you needed." I turned then toward Thomas and said, "You deserve to choose with your eyes open." Those sentences felt like handing two people a mirror at once. To Mom and Caroline I said, "Contact me only through counsel, nothing more." I handed the venue manager a USB with vendor statements and the affidavits. I watched as he slid it into his jacket with the professional neutrality of someone who knows records matter. I kept my hands empty and my shoulders steady as I walked out. People rose and watched me go. Some eyes were curious, some grateful, some shocked, some simply following the freight of gossip. I left through the same doors I'd come in, not hurried but not slow either. The light there on the river made the air look like a photograph, sun bright on water, people clustered into knots. I felt strangely calm, not because the outcome was neat or kind, but because I had done what I'd planned. I had placed truth where charm could not reach it. Behind me, I heard a flurry of voices and the beginning of explanations, of phone calls where people who had been sure started to ask questions. I walked away knowing the road ahead would have courtrooms and depositions and people who would try to pin motives on me. I was ready for those steps because I had spent nights turning anger into evidence and friends whose steadiness matched my own. The thing I wanted most in that moment was simple: autonomy. I had lost a wedding, yes, but I had found a stance I would hold to from then on. Thomas and Gregory left together. That in itself was a message. They had chosen distance from the person whose name had been used in the cards. Caroline's dress sat like a costume abandoned on a chair. Staff at the venue took statements and made incident reports with the same professionalism they'd used to coordinate floral deliveries. Their forms became part of my file, my phone filled with texts, friends, former friends, distant relatives. Some said they were sorry, some said they didn't know, some asked for details they didn't deserve. I read them in the cold light of a kitchen lamp and replied only when I had to. There would be time to answer everyone properly. For now, preservation mattered more than consolation. I emailed the boutique manager to confirm the security stills and asked a baker to provide the affidavit in writing. Small things that felt like procedural nudges now had real weight. Caroline's consequences started almost immediately. The nonprofit's board called an emergency meeting within 24 hours. They froze operations and requested all financial records. I watched from a distance as people wrote statements, and as a board member I barely knew sent me a message saying, "Thank you for coming forward." Caroline resigned for personal reasons on the nonprofit's website. The announcement felt like an apology cut down to size. She deleted professional profiles and blocked people on social media in what felt like an attempt to control a narrative that was slipping. Donors who had been on the fence withdrew pledges or asked for audits. The mailbox used for questionable shipments was subpoenaed. I received a forwarded notice that investigators had requested the nonprofit's bank records for the past 3 years. It was not a conviction, it was the beginning of a chain I had started and could not now unmake. The engagement ended the way many do when the fabric of a relationship is tested by truth, with silence and then with a small message. Thomas sent a text that said simply, "You were right to show me." It was brief and contained more than I could ask for. Word spread among Caroline's social circle. People who had been eager to support her now faced their own embarrassment and reckoning. Her posts went from polished pleas to defensive statements and then to nothing. Her allies in civic groups avoided public comments. Some reached out privately with apologies, others disappeared. The boutique requested the gown back for evidence, and the bakery sent a signed statement clarifying who had authorized the change. Those small, official corrections stacked into a dam of accountability that would be hard to unbuild. Mom's consequences came in a different register. For years, she'd been able to use charm and performance to smooth over awkward things. Now those tools failed. The civil complaint named her, and her deposition would require her to answer questions under oath. Her friends started asking for explanations, and invitations she once used as a stage quietly stopped arriving. She sent messages through relatives, thin strings of perfunctory remorse that read like attempts to rewrite what had happened rather than to repair it. I replied only through my attorney. She showed up at family gatherings and found them colder, full of polite distance. People who once let her dictate the tone of a room now asked for boundaries she could not charm away. Watching Mom meet a limit she could not bypass was both small revenge and a painful calibration. She was my mother, after all, and the role reversal felt raw. Vendors who had once tolerated her phone calls with a smile now asked for written authorization and identification. That shift in attitude was partly practical but also symbolic. People stopped accepting Mom's version at face value. Her social network fractured because the things that had tied people to her, access, favor, small performances of care, no longer compensated for the risk of being associated with wrongdoing. She reached for me tentatively through mutual acquaintances, and each attempt was met with a reply from my lawyer. I had no interest in being her fixer or emotional patch. My choice was to let the legal process be the conversation she could not charm. It was a strange relief to know she could not manipulate the systems I'd used to hold her accountable. Around me, social recalibration moved like tectonic plates shifting under a familiar map. Extended family sent messages that tried to compress the whole thing into a sentence. We didn't know. Some were sincere. Others were a reflexive defense of comfort and denial. I answered with simple acknowledgement, "I know you didn't," and let it be. At work, colleagues who had once overlooked my needs started seeing me as someone who had agency. My director commended my steadiness in a staff meeting and assigned me to lead a small audit team, work that suited my habits and gave me room to breathe. The autonomy I'd fought for bled into practical changes. I moved into a small apartment with locks I chose and my own lease, and for the first time I felt the ordinary security that comes from living on your own terms. Friends who had watched me shrink in family settings began to treat me differently. They asked for my time on weekdays rather than holding it for the rare occasions Mom curated. Maya and I started going to the farmers market on Sunday mornings. We'd sit with coffee and talk about nothing important, and that small normalcy felt like a kind of repair. Donors and community members reached out privately to say they were sorry they hadn't seen earlier signs. I didn't need apologies to prove the point. We had documents now, but the human recognition mattered in its own small way. It felt like the difference between being anonymous and being someone whose experience counted. Financially, the deposits and damages I pursued would not buy back the wedding, but they bought breathing room. Vendors reimbursed deposits when evidence of impersonation was clear. The bakery refunded a portion. the boutique cooperated with evidence and agreed to hold the gown for investigators. I kept everything in labeled folders and backed it up into cloud storage with encryption. The money recovered paid for my attorney and for moving expenses. It was practical restitution, not poetic justice, but it was tangible and useful. The most durable outcome, though, was not money. It was a shift in how people saw me. I was no longer the background character in my family's story. I had a voice that mattered, a file that proved it, and a life I could order by my own decisions. Mom sold the house. She said she needed a fresh start, but the truth was quieter. People stopped inviting her the way they used to, and the audience that fed her confidence evaporated. Where she used to call neighbors and fill rooms, she now called distant relatives who answered politely and then hung up. For the first time, she had to hire help for things she'd always managed with talk and charm. Accountants, a moving team, a lawyer to sort papers she'd once kept in drawers. Asking for help looked foreign on her, and the strain was small and sharp. I didn't go to the closing. I let the legal papers be the conversation between her and the world she'd used to stage herself in. I wasn't interested in watching Mom reinvent herself under pressure. I'd already built a life that didn't need her version of order. I stand by the river sometimes now, not at the old venue, but at a smaller event space across town, watching light fall on the water. Maya joins me with coffee in paper cups and an easy laugh, the kind that doesn't try to explain anything. We don't rehearse the past. We talk about what's next, small things like work projects and travel plans, the kind of steady choices I never allowed myself before because I was holding so much other people's weight. There's a peace to not needing witnesses to prove I exist. I don't need a dress or a stage. I need a life I can keep. The power I reclaimed sits quiet in my hands like a key. It opens doors I choose to open. If you've survived a family betrayal and took your power back, tell me in the comments. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and come back. There are more quiet ones with loud consequences.